he's feeling anything right now, Bob?
Yeah, he was talking to himself.
What began on May 30th, 1982, and continues September 6th, 1995. This game, with the Angels trailing, is now in the books. And let it be said that number 8, Cal Ripken Jr., has reached the unreachable star.
Baseball fans loved themselves an Iron Man. This standing ovation for Cal Ripken Jr. breaking the MLB's consecutive games played record lasted for over 20 minutes. Even as one of the most decorated hitters to ever play the shortstop position, the streak remains one of Ripken's defining achievements. His streak broke the record of the Iron Horse, Lou Gehrig, who's about as well known for only leaving the Yankee lineup when physically unable to play due to ALS as he is for driving in runs behind Babe Ruth. Suffice it to say, players like Gehrig and Ripken do not come around very often. As far as pitchers go, the Iron Man moniker is especially difficult to come by. This is largely due to pitcher workloads, as even the most durable of workhorses only toe the rubber every 5 or so days. The pinnacle of pitching longevity is certainly Nolan Ryan, who maintained peak performance for over a quarter century, but even the Ryan Express maxed out at 42 appearances in a season. At the end of the day, for a starting pitcher to do what you could call an old hoss Radburn and start over 70 games in a season is simply impossible in the modern era. There was a reliever, though, who in the 1970s made his own run at the Ironman title. He was the pitcher's answer to this character, a reliever who twice broke the record for appearances in a season. His record number is so gaudy that no one has come within 10% of it before or since. Now what if I told you the guy who did all that was about 5'9" and trained differently than just about any other pitcher in his era? His name was Mike Marshall. They called him Iron Mike. In 1965, though, absolutely nothing about Mike Marshall would have screamed future elite MLB pitcher. He was a Double-A shortstop who in his free time was working towards a PhD in kinesiology from Michigan State. The 22-year-old minor leaguer who had chronic back problems thought that pitching would be easier on his back, so he wanted to change positions. The Phillies, the organization Marshall was playing for, did not want him to do that, and when you take a deeper look at things, you can begin to understand why. The following are Mike Marshall's stats from his final 3 seasons of hitting in the Phillies organization. Those numbers look pretty decent, right? I mean, the guy averaged out over 3 years to a nearly 800 OPS guy. I get it though, minor league stats can be a little tricky, so let's give these numbers some context. 50 years after Marshall, the Phillies had another shortstop prospect and former first-round pick and future Mariners shortstop J.P. Crawford. Above Marshall's totals, I'm going to give you Crawford's numbers from his 2015 season across High A and Double A. Their average, on-base, slugging, and OPS are all within 6 points of each other. You would be pretty hard-pressed to find 2 more identical slash lines. Now I understand there would be a multitude of reasons as to why this would make a pretty crappy true player comp. Let's forget that for a second though. Coming off that season, J.P. Crawford entered 2016 as a consensus top 6 prospect in baseball. Imagine if he had gone to the Phillies front office that offseason and said, hey, I want to be a pitcher now. The 2015 Phillies front office would have, just as the 1965 one did, laughed in his face. Following the 65 season, the Phillies became the first of what would be many franchises to trade Mike Marshall. They dumped him to Detroit, who sent him to Seattle, who sent him to Houston, who sent him to Montreal, all in the span of 4 years. The hang-up was Marshall's screwball, his signature pitch, and one that nobody wanted him to throw. Made famous by Hall of Famers Christy Mathewson and Carl Hubble, by the 70s the pitch had fallen out of favor with the baseball world. At the time, the screwball was thought to kill arms. Mike Marshall, who thought he knew better than anyone else about everything, disagreed. In Marshall's defense, when he and conventional baseball wisdom disagreed, he was usually right. Either way, the trade to Montreal set in motion the stretch where Mike Marshall became arguably the premier pitcher in the National League. You see, the difference between Montreal and every other stop Marshall had been jettisoned from was that manager Gene Mauch didn't keep trying to tell his pitcher what to do. Everywhere he had been, Marshall had burned bridges and gotten sold off because teams told him to quit throwing screwballs and he said no. Mauch knew that his reliever, the kinesiology student, understood what he was doing. I don't argue with Marshall, Mauch said. He's extremely intelligent and he's thinking all the time. He knows what he is doing better than anybody else. Marshall wanted to lift weights when that was thought to be for football players? Go for it. Marshall wants to throw screwballs snowballs sounds good. The results from this were astounding. Instituted as the Expos fireman, that is, the 70s predecessor to the closer, Marshall put up an ERA over 4 in 1971, but made it his first of 4 straight seasons leading the NL in games finished. He followed that year up by firmly planting himself into the Cy Young conversation in 72 and 73. Not only did Marshall post a sub-3 ERA in both seasons, but he led the National League in saves in 1973. Most impressive, however, was Marshall's workloads. He became the second ever pitcher to record 90 appearances in a season, setting a new MLB record with 92. For his exploits, Marshall finished top 5 in Cy Young and top 10 in MVP voting for both of those seasons. Marshall was voted the best pitcher in the National League, not named future Hall of Famer Tom Seaver in 1973. That is pretty good. For all this success, and every other success he had in baseball, Marshall credited Gene Mauch. Given all of this newfound goodwill, Marshall took advantage of it by, as his Sabre article put it, yet again lodging his foot into his mouth. First, he embarrassed the team sponsor by refusing a $5,000 check for the team's most outstanding player because teammates shouldn't be competing for individual awards. He followed that by saying in an interview that the Expos' defense stank, and then said exactly whose defense he thought stank. He would later claim he thought he said this off the record, but either way, trashing your teammates to the press is not a good look. At this point in time, Mike Marshall was the reigning Cy Young runner-up and for 2 years running had finished top 10 in MVP voting. He was the Expos' best player, but still had worn out his welcome. The Expos were done with him. Marshall was going to Los Angeles. Not only was he leaving the first place where he'd had serious big league success, but Marshall was also leaving the manager he'd had it with. Gene Mauch had been willing to let Marshall do things his own way and had understood the pitcher's desires to pitch extremely often. Now it was up to Marshall to convince Walter Alston of the same. These are two skippers who, while both very well regarded as managers, were at completely different stages of their careers. For Marshall's last season in Montreal, Gene Mauch was 47 years old and was managing the big leagues for over another decade. Walter Alston was 62 years old in 1974. He had already cemented himself as a Hall of Famer with 4 World Series and 7 pennants in his over 20 years as Dodger manager. If there was a manager who would have had every reason to be stuck in his ways, it was Walter Alston. Before the season, Marshall told Alston he would let him know any day he was unable to pitch. He would otherwise be willing to pitch every day if Alston thought he could help win a game. Out of the gate in 1974, Alston seemed receptive to what Marshall said. Marshall did not appear in 3 straight blowouts to begin the season, but followed that by appearing in 5 straight Dodger games in early April. After a brief 2-game hiatus, Marshall then again pitched in 6 consecutive games for Los Angeles. 3 off days for Marshall and then another 6 straight made it 17 of the first 25 Dodger games that Mike Marshall pitched in. All in all, out of the first 50 games that season, Marshall appeared in 33 of them. That's nearly 2 out of every 3 games that Marshall had been on the mound for. For some perspective, the previous season, when Marshall had set the record for appearances in a season, he had pitched in about 56% of the Expos games that year. We're talking about a nearly 10% increase from the previous high watermark in baseball history. It's a pace so far above anything we'd ever seen before that you almost have to assume it's unsustainable. That's what makes what he did next all the more impressive, because sustain it is exactly what he did. He pitched in 33 out of 50, then 68 out of 100, and then 106 out of 162. His final total amounted to 65.4% of his team's games for the season. He outpaced his previous record by 14 games. As Vince Scully described it in Game 1 of the 1974 World Series,
during the season, we'd always have the gag. It wouldn't be a Dodger ball game if you didn't have a hot dog, a soft drink, and see Mike Marshall.
Clearly, Alston had thought that Marshall could help the team win a lot, and he had good reason, too. Marshall finished the season with over 200 innings as a closer, with a 2.42 ERA. That's a lower ERA and more innings than 2021 Corbin Burns. To go with this great season, Marshall was named an All-Star, the Dodgers went to the World Series, and Marshall topped 2 of his teammates and Phil Niekro for the Cy Young Award. With that vote, Mike Marshall became the first ever relief pitcher to win the award. That alone makes this season special, but even amongst some of the greatest seasons ever pitched, it remains an anomaly. Here's a graph of every Cy Young winner plotted by ERA and games pitched. At first glance, there's a huge jumble in the middle where the vast majority of these seasons lie, but there are a couple of outliers that do stand out. Down at the bottom, we have our winners from 2020, when Trevor Bauer and Shane Bieber pitched in 11 and 12 games apiece in the COVID-shortened season. Way off to the left, we have Bob Gibson's 1968, which is widely considered the greatest season ever pitched, with a 1.12 ERA and 34 starts. Above Gibson and the rest of the starters to the top, then, sit some of the great relief seasons of all time. These include a 1.04 ERA from Raleigh Fingers in 1981, and Eric Gagne, whose 2003 was so dominant that the Dodgers would put game over on the scoreboard when he came in. Then there is 1987 Steve Bedrosian. All in all, this is a chart of some of the most memorable pitching seasons of all time, but there is one missing. If you move up high enough, sitting 26 games above the next highest Cy Young winner, you have Mike Marshall. I showed this graph to give some perspective on how different and special Marshall's 1974 was relative to the best of the best. I don't actually think, though, that for a pitcher whose defining superpower is how much he pitches, a group of predominantly starters, albeit some of the most elite, give a fair scale to that. This next plot will not have that problem. This is a graph of each of the 134 seasons by a pitcher in MLB history to record at least 80 appearances. To better account for the one-out specialists of the world, the x-axis for this one is going to be innings pitched. We want volume, not just appearances. Our first notable pitcher we're going to look at here is at the bottom with 1984 AL MVP Willie Hernandez, the only other Cy Young winner on this list. He pitched in 80 games that year on his way to the MVP, Cy Young Award, and World Series championship. His season is notable, but not for this exercise. Let's move up to the top. There are 9 individual seasons that currently live in the 90-game club. One of them is Pedro Feliciano's 2010, which included just 62.2 innings but 92 appearances as the ultimate lefty one-out guy. Solomon Torres just about matched his games pitched with his innings count for the 2010 Pirates, tying for second all-time in appearances in the process. These 2 seasons are the most recent for this group, and for this conversation, probably also the least relevant. Let's move on. The guy whose appearance record Marshall broke was Wayne Granger of the Cincinnati Reds, who held the record for 4 seasons before Marshall took it in 1973. The founding member of this group, Granger pitched 90 times as a 25-year-old and then was worth negative WAR for the rest of his career. That leaves 6 spots for 2 guys. We'll start with the one who's not Marshall. Kent Tekulve crossed the 90-game mark 3 times in the 70s and 80s. Best known as the closer for the 1979 We Are Family Pirates when he pitched in 94 games, Tekulve also pitched in 91 games the year prior and 90 as a 40-year-old for the 1987 Phillies. Most impressively, he did it all while looking more like a high school geometry teacher than pro athlete. What a legend. With Tekulve out of the way, though, we are left with Mike Marshall, the king of pitching all the time. Way off to the right is Marshall's 1973, which lasts as the record for appearances in a season for exactly 1 year, with way more innings pitched than anybody else in this group so far. Next to Wayne Granger is the other Marshall appearance of this group when he pitched in 90 games as a 36-year-old for the 1979 Twins. To get to 1974, though, we are going to need to zoom out. Remember when I first showed this graph and there was a bunch of extra room on the right and every single data point was way off to the left for some reason? Yeah, that's because 1974 Mike Marshall paces the field by 12 games and 29 innings. For all of you numbers people, here are the numbers to everything I just said. As you can see, even in a collection of absolute anomaly seasons, Marshall stands completely alone. Think about it this way. Among pitchers to throw at least 80 appearances in a season, not named Mike Marshall, the closest innings pitched total is only 79% of Mike Marshall's 1974. The closest game total to Marshall is also not even within 10% of his number. Here's some perspective on how absurd that is. If someone were to break Barry Bonds' single-season home run record by the same percent that Marshall leads in games pitched, he would have to hit 82 home runs. To break the career mark by the same degree, someone would have to hit 859. It goes without saying, it would probably be pretty much impossible for anyone to get even close to that. The same goes for Marshalls, especially with how pitchers are handled in the 2020s. Since 2020, there have only been 2 pitchers to pass 80 games in a season, and those 2 seasons peaked at 81 games. At this point in time, with the amount of focus that there is on player health and longevity, it just feels like it's almost impossible for anyone to get even close to 100 games. It is, for all intents and purposes, a completely unbreakable record. Unless you really care about high-volume relievers, this probably isn't the best relief season of all time, but it certainly lives amongst the most unique. The end of the 1974 regular season wasn't the end of Mike Marshall's story, though. For a quick synopsis, the Dodgers lost the 1974 World Series, and while Marshall gave up just 1 run in that entire series, it was a pivotal home run in Game 5. He had refused to take extra warm-up pitches after a long delay, and for it many of his teammates never forgave him. He was again an All-Star in 1975, but missed time, not due to his arm, but due to his rib cartilage. Marshall blamed his love handles. He wore out his welcome with LA then too, then with Atlanta, then with Texas. He rejoined his old friend Gene Mauch in Minnesota, where he was again dominant for 2 years, but by the end of his stay in Minneapolis, wasn't even on speaking terms with Mauch anymore. After a year in New York with the Mets, Marshall, who had never really fit in with the baseball establishment, was effectively excommunicated from it. He would never work in baseball again. So let's talk about Marshall's legacy beyond just his playing career. For as much as he made people mad by always acting like he knew more about everything than them, he kind of did. Many of his ideas ended up being right. Of the 3 pitchers who talked to Marshall about arm health, the shortest career of them lasted 12 years. The other 2 were Don Sutton, who pitched for 23 years and made the Hall of Fame, and Tommy John, who pitched for 26. His approach and ideas were influential in the creation of Driveline, one of baseball's premier data-driven pitching companies. Many of those ideas, like weighted ball training, emphasis on spin, and slow-motion video, ended up becoming foundational principles of 21st century pitching training. In spite of this, for all the credit Marshall wanted for his brilliance, he never really got what he deserved. Instead, Marshall's legacy outside of his pitching career is probably the downright peculiar pitching motion he taught to prevent injuries, which, to be fair, yeah, this one was probably a miss. As baseball's preeminent Ironmen, the stories of Cal Ripken Jr. and Lou Gehrig are ones that everyone knows, and deservedly so. If we take the time to think about Mike Marshall, though, we see not just the sports pitching Iron Man, nicknamed after a pitching machine, but one of the most interesting baseball minds of his era. Mike Marshall passed away in June 2021. Maybe we can honor his legacy by giving him the flowers that he deserves too.